NetSparker, the developers of desktop and cloud-based web application security scanners that enable you to automatically identify vulnerabilities in your web applications and web services. NetSparker scanners employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities with their proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at securityweekly.com/NetSparker. Well, welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Quick announcement before we get started. Our next webcast is on January 15th, coming up soon. Cecilia Mariner from the RSA Conference Program Director. She is the RSA Conference Program Director. Innovation and Scholars will discuss the RSA Sandbox, Innovation Sandbox, Launchpad, and all things RSAC, a how-to seminar for our innovators, and more. Register for our upcoming webcast by visiting securityweekly.com, selecting the webcast drop-down menu from the top bar, and clicking registration. All of the hosts previously are here with us, and we'd like to welcome our guest. Chris Painter is a globally recognized leader and expert on cyber policy, cyber diplomacy, and combating cybercrime. He's been on the vanguard of the U.S. and international cyber issues for over 25 years, first as a federal prosecutor in some of the most high-profile criminal cases. Chris, welcome to the program.
Happy to be here.
It's nice to have you. Chris, I wanted to start by asking you kind of how you got your start in cybersecurity, right? It's some of our guests have a technical path. Yours was more of sounded like a legal path, but how did you get involved in cyber law and cybercrime?
Well, I was always interested in technology, so that, I always had a passion for it. I think my first computer was an Atari 800 with a cassette tape drive.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, you earned just your respect from ourselves and our audience right there.
And then, when I went to a law firm, I'm a recovering lawyer, so I went to a law firm. I did some technology cases, but that was back in the 80s. And then when I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, to a federal prosecuting office in Los Angeles, I was interested in these cases. There weren't a lot of them then, but there were some big hacker cases, some big denial of service cases, some big, internet stock manipulation, other cases. I just wanted to do. I worked with the FBI and other agencies on them, and I got into them. I learned the technology along the way, too. I was always interested in technology, but I learned, programming and certain languages and other things just to be able to understand the case files. And it just became my passion for the rest of my career in the government, and still now.
What's interesting, Chris, is one of the books I just read talks about Atari early on, which was one of your first computers, right? And their intellectual property in the lawsuits is very interesting in their software. I don't know if you've ever looked into that.
Yeah. I mean, now Atari is sort of making a comeback as a little standalone console, but everyone thought Atari was going to be ruling the world at one point. If you remember it in one of my favorite movies, Blade Runner, Atari's all over the background then,
right.
And it doesn't exist anymore, really.
Mm-hmm. So when we look at the past 20 years in cybercrime, and you described very briefly some of the first kind of cybercrime incidents, right? What progress have we made in being able to prosecute cyber criminals, specifically over international borders and such?
I mean, I think there are a couple aspects of it. We've made a lot of progress. At the same time, and this is really not surprising, the cyber criminals have become ever more clever and smart in the way and more sophisticated. And the range of criminals we see, not just criminals, but also nation states and other actors, has become more diverse. Their attacks have become more sophisticated. You don't just have the lone gunman hackers like you had back when I started this. You have transnational organized crime. You have, as I said, state actors and others. We've become better at fighting cybercrime because more countries have laws now that punish this. That wasn't always the case. Still, a lot don't, so that's somewhere we have to grow. We've taken down a lot of these big cases. Some of these cases, although in a sense criminal, we don't really attack them as criminal cases. When they're a nation-state case, when they're state-sponsored, like we've seen a lot recently, we've used other tools. So I think we've made some advancements, but we're always playing catch-up. And I think as these attacks become more sophisticated and these intrusions become more sophisticated, and as we become more reliant, we're already very reliant on the technology, this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue. So the cybercrime fight, I always think of as the flip side of the cybersecurity challenge. You want to, harden your targets. You want to have good cybersecurity. But when someone breaches those targets, you have to make sure there are consequences. And that's consequences for criminals, but also consequences for nation states.
Yeah, and the nation state aspect is interesting because in your various roles and reading your background, I want to ask you how you deal with the fact, like the elephant in the room is if there's a nation state that is attacking the United States and it stems from the government within that country, how do you go about prosecuting the people if the government of that country wants to basically cover it up, right?
Well, and in my career, I was a prosecutor. Then I became, I went to the White House and then I went to the State Department. So I was looking at different aspects of how you go after these. Criminals, just normal criminals or transnational organized crime, not easy, but pretty simple because you go after these cases and you prosecute them criminally. It's a nation state, you really can't prosecute them. You might be able to go after some of the actors who are acting on behalf of the nation state, but you have to look at the other tools you have. And I think some of the things we've done when, for instance, Russia has done some actions, or sometimes China, is we've looked at things like economic sanctions, we've looked at diplomatic tools, we've looked at cyber tools, we've looked at a range of different state tools we have and we working with partners in other countries who are also being victimized by these attacks and said, how can we address this? Now, the big problem I have is we have been doing a lot of work and saying, well, what are the rules of the road in cyberspace? It's not just the wild, wild west. There are rules. There are criminal rules for criminals. There are rules for nation states too, and we've been doing a lot of work on that. But if there's no consequences for people who violate those rules are just words on paper. And so we have not done a great job, in my opinion, at really countering the nation state behavior, really imposing costs on those bad actors for a lot of different things we've seen over the last couple of years. And that's where we really need to improve. Yeah,
and so, Chris, I think for many of us on this program and listening, right, is when we talk about sanctions with, let's say, China, right, I have a personal connection there because I order a lot of electronics from China, right?
That's where all the best shit comes from.
Right? But also extending a much farther beyond that, a lot of us, specifically in technology and specifically in security, we get our start in prototyping stuff and even building companies based on the fact we can source stuff from China at a very low cost. So what are some of the political ramifications outside of my very narrow view of the world that have to be taken into consideration to, again, have a penalty for this type of behavior?
Look, there are two kinds of sanctions. There's the sanctions that I think you've seen recently from the White House, which are more trade sanctions. So they're more broad and they cover lots of different goods. There's the targeted sanctions that you apply to try to go after and respond to bad behavior. So, and again, I don't think we've done a great job at this. A good example is Russia and election interference. We've done some sanctions with Russia, but not really in a strategic way and not in a targeted way that's going to change Putin's calculus. With China, yes, we have to balance it. Sanctions cause us harm too. So we have to make sure we're doing this in a way that actually has the effect we want on the decision maker, the other country, and makes them change their ways. And that's one part of the solution. Sanctions are not the whole solution. There's lots of other things you need to do. Now, one of the things I think we did well with China at one point is I was part of the team, a big part of the team that negotiated the deal with China on theft of intellectual property, which is the big deal a few years ago. And we finally reached an agreement. And the reason we reached an agreement is it was constant pressure from everyone in the administration, the Obama administration and others, in other countries too. And it was clear this wasn't a boutique cyber thing. This was a major issue of national security and economic security, and we were willing to risk friction in the overall U.S. relationship. Now, that deal has gone south now. The deal's still there, but it's not really being observed by China now. But that's more because the overall relationship is so bad. But I think we can reach that kind of thing again with China. I think it's harder when we talk about supply chain and 5G and other issues. So, yeah, you're right. Sanctions can have an effect both on the sanctioning party and the sanctioned party, but you have to have the right mix of things where the end goal is if you're trying to deter a bad actor in the future and you're trying to make sure they don't gain from what they did right now, you have to have that right mix of tools that it's going to cause some pain for them. Otherwise, they'll just do it again.
Right.
And when the real danger is, and I'll take Russia as an example, when we have folks in the White House saying, well, I'm not even sure Russia did it, that sends a very bad message. And Russia is like, look, I'm not paying real costs for this, so why not do it again? And people on the sidelines who are thinking of doing this, they're like, well, if Russia's not paying a cost for this, why don't we do this again? And that makes it a much less stable environment for all of us.
Do we have things like, so from a U.S. standpoint, do we have things like a Geneva Convention for how we operate and retaliate outside of say, sanctions? Can we and do we retaliate on a regular basis?
But we don't. I mean, I don't think we do it. This is the problem. We don't have a consistent strategic way of doing this. Now, there's been some efforts in my old group at the State Department and others in the U.S. government working with other countries to have this deterrence initiative, where the idea is you'll systematically impose costs with other partners acting together in a flexible alliance on bad actors. Now, we haven't done that very well so far, but at least that path, I think, is a good one. There is the Geneva Convention. People have talked about, do you need a Geneva Convention for cyberspace? And I don't think you need a whole new convention, because international law, including the Geneva Convention, applies in cyberspace now. We just have to enforce it. What we have been focusing a lot on is those activities. Geneva Convention is like acts of war. It's really bad stuff, right? Most of what we see in cyberspace is bad, but it's below that threshold. We haven't seen, thankfully, people die, et cetera, in cyber attacks in a major way. So we've been working with in the UN and other venues to say, what are the rules of the road? What are the norms in cyberspace? Don't attack the critical infrastructure of another country absent wartime. Don't go after the CERTs, the C-CERTs. They're like the ambulances, the hospitals, for the internet. So, and we got agreement among countries, including Russia and China. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to abide by those rules. But then, again, you have to have the consequences for the actions when they don't.
Right. Yeah, well, because it's a different thing. If something blows up, it's pretty easy to see that something has blown up. When something happens on the internet or in cyberspace, right, we don't necessarily see that. It's much easier to hide the fact that you might be violating some global law.
There are two kinds of, right? There's the theft of information, which is not an attack. I mean, I hate it when people say attacks for everything, and I hate it when people use the term
it's stealing,
cyber 11 or cyber war, because we don't really have a cyber war. But that theft information is usually they don't want that to be seen. When they're trying to attack something, causing denial of service attack, or the NotPetya worm or the WannaCry worm, in part they want that that impact. They may not want to be. May not want it to be seen that they're doing it, but they want that impact to be out there.
Yeah, that's where the cutout and or the secondary ramifications come into play. Like if you're a nation state or a criminal syndicate, at that point, if you're using a cutout or you're testing an exploit or you're trying to damage a particular enterprise, like you're not going to do it directly where you're causing mass destruction. You're doing it for a specific goal or mission, right?
Yeah,
and I think that's where we're not seeing.
Yeah, you could be testing capabilities. You could be doing a low level, and some people have argued some of the big, worms we've seen have been tested capabilities that got out of hand. But that's certainly one thing you can do. Any sophisticated hacker worth their salt is not going to just attack them for their own system. They're going to route it through proxies in other countries and other people, both criminals and nation states. There is this myth, though, that we cannot do attribution in cyberspace, so we can't tell who does the bad things. And of course, it's difficult for all the reasons you guys know, but it's not impossible, especially for attacks that last a long period of time or a very, very high level. We're able to do that attribution. We've been able to do it several times in the past. And I think that attribution sort of cloud where especially the bad actors say, both in cyberspace and in the physical world, look, it's not me, you can't prove it's me. I think that's just a smokescreen. I think we can often do the attribution, but then we have to take action. We've done well in the last 2 years is we started calling out the bad actions with other countries, like the US, Australia, the UK, Estonia, and some others came out and said that the NotPetya worm was Russia, and that was a bad thing.
Well, great. We also don't want to turn our hand to that, right?
I'm sorry?
So we also don't want to turn our hand and be able to demonstrate our capabilities. And so not only the attribution, but the retribution and or our capabilities, we're careful about displaying how we do that.
Yeah, it's always a challenge, right? So on the one hand, I think for years there was a thought that, well, we won't want to tell the other side that we know that what they're doing. But the problem with that is they keep doing it, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to balance your intelligence gathering with actually having an impact. And I think more and more the U.S. and other governments are leaning towards saying, look, we're going to call out bad activity. We don't have to show all of our proof. I mean, it's frustrating sometimes because, countries are never going to release in the physical world or cyber world all the proof they had. When North Korea went after Sony Pictures, I remember it was in the State Department. I called a number of my colleagues and said the president is going out tomorrow and say is North Korea, and you support it? And many did, but many of them wanted some of the proof, and we were able to give some of that to them. We released more proof than we ever did in that circumstance, but then a lot of the pundits, very sophisticated pundits, said it was North Korea before Obama said it was, and when he said it was, they said, well, I don't think it's North Korea, there's not enough evidence, until 6 months ago when there was a 185-page criminal complaint that came out, then even these pundits, I guess it was North Korea. So get over the...
Sorry, did someone else have a question?
Yeah, I did.
Lee.
So, as we're talking about cross-border incidents, and so how important is it anymore to have resources in the other country to help our investigations? And I realize when it's nation state, the locals are going to be not terribly inclined to step in. But ignoring that for a second, or can we do everything from this side of the pond, as it were?
No, we absolutely cannot do everything on our own. I mean, this has to be a collective approach. So even when you're acting as nation states, it's better when you act together than you do alone. There may be some time you have the flaming ball of cyber death that's coming toward you where you have to act on your own. But most of the time, you can and should act with other countries. It gives you more legitimacy. It gives you more tools to use. It's a better way of going about it. The problem is that a lot of the countries around the world are just getting into cyber. Yes, a lot of the countries in Europe and Japan and the Five Eyes countries, they get this. Some of them are even getting more advanced now. But a lot of countries are still the side path to this. They don't really understand this. They don't have national level certs. They don't have trained law enforcement. They may have laws in place. And so what that means is it's in the U.S. interest, and it's really in the world interest for us to engage in capacity building around the world, actually helping these countries, teaching them investigative techniques, helping them have laws in place, helping them have certs, just standard national level certs to exchange information with each other, having national strategies in countries. That's been a big push from a number of organizations. I'm a part of an organization called the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise, one of the many acronyms in this area, but a really good one. It's about 71 countries. It's a lot of industry. It's a lot of civil society groups, all working globally to try to do better capacity building around a range of issues: cybercrime, standards, norms and diplomacy, national strategies, incident response, just a wide variety of things. And that's a critical need right now. I think we have to realize that that's going to pay dividends in helping protect us in the future.
Chris, I have a question along those lines. Pardon me, Lee.
Go ahead.
We look at Ring, which, as we very much know as security professionals, credential stuffing attack, but really kind of raised a lot of awareness recently about the vulnerabilities in IoT devices. Now, some have said in the past that we could pass laws in the U.S. or standards or any type of guideline that says when you produce an IoT device, it has to have this minimum level of security. We've questioned that and said, well, if a lot of our stuff is coming from another country like China or other countries, how do we then enforce those standards, laws, or guidelines on those other countries as well? And I'm curious if you're addressing that issue, as I'm sure you are in your working group.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big issue. I would say my favorite Internet of Things story, and this actually happened, was a number of connected refrigerators were used to do a denial of service attack against some banking websites, and I thought that was a great new use of the term "freezing your assets." Need a little more research and development.
Love it.
But what's been happening is Europe, for instance, has this new cybersecurity law that came out of the EU, and that creates voluntary standards, voluntary certifications for not just Internet of Things devices, but a lot of cybersecurity devices. The U.S. has talked for years about having something like the Underwriters Laboratory listing or something like that. So there's different levels you could do. You could do voluntary soft, labeling, which means people are more likely to buy something if it has that certification. Or you could do more regulatory approaches, which we haven't done in this country yet. So I think what's happening in Europe is going to end up spreading to this country too. You're right. Other countries can, they can be manufactured other places, just like anything else we see.
Right.
But if it's certified and you say, okay, I want this more certified one, I want the safer one, that would be good. Now, the problem is they're not educated about this. They'll buy the cheaper device. So there has to be something that helps drive them in that direction. And that's true for cyber writ large, not just for Internet of Things.
So what's critical for success?
I mean, that's a problem, though, with
Yeah,
Yeah, that's the problem with consumers, though, right? Like they're not going to change their buying habits based on a certification. I mean, look at UL, right? Like no one really looks for that label anymore. And we'll be honest, like the generations that are purchasing, the younger generations don't even know what that is. And so if we're talking about a soft branding, those are not going to really push a consumer. It's all about price and feature. And so really putting the pressure on the manufacturer from what standpoint? How do we go about putting that pressure back to the manufacturers?
Well, one thing you could do is you could graduate this. So in other words, you have a more mandatory certification regime for things that are going to be used for critical purposes in critical infrastructure, for things like self-driving cars, for health services, things that are, if they go wrong, really wrong. Now, that doesn't get you to things like the connected cameras that were used, like the Mirai botnet that was used as an attack vector, but will take away a lot of the really dangerous things that can happen here. So I think we have to start thinking about this graduated scale. There's some in Congress that are thinking about this. I don't really think there's going to be much legislation coming out anytime soon. I think even the European legislation is voluntary, but it becomes more mandatory for critical instances, and that's determined on the state-by-state basis. That's a new law there, so we have to see how it goes. But I do worry about that. I do think, look, for years, in Germany very different from the U.S., people pay extra for internet security from their ISPs. And here, if an ISP charges more, often people will just go for the cheaper ISPs. Now, a lot of the ISPs have changed their model to emphasize security, and maybe as people see this as a bigger issue, that will help. But we've been talking for 20 years about security as a sales, as something that would help sales, and it just hasn't caught on yet.
Yeah, because even as popular of a story as the Ring was, a month from now, when people go shop for any kind of doorbell or camera, they're going to forget that happened, right?
Yeah, and that's the problem with cyber generally. I mean, as much as I want cyber and I care about it deeply, to be a core issue of security and economic policy and diplomacy in everyone's life today, the fact is most people, they think about cyber when there's a big incident, when it's on the front pages, and then it fades away. And so, we have to do more to really ingrain that this as a core issue, because I think in the future it will. I don't think we get there by talking about cyber 9/11s or cyber Pearl Harbors. I think we really point out what costs are. And, when people are losing their data, when they're losing their personal data, when they're losing financial information, that will start having an effect. Maybe at some point we're going to have liability for these issues. I've talked about that for 20 years. We haven't had either. But I think we really have to start seeing this as a big issue, because if it doesn't become a big issue, if cybersecurity is undermined, then what will happen, I think, in the long run is a lot of these innovative technologies will be undermined. People are not going to put up with in the long term things that are still totally unreliable. They'll forget the small things, but the big things they won't. And we'll have to see how that plays out.
And I think the small things are less critical as individual companies and or like individual products themselves. The big risk that you see is, like you said, things like the botnets that are leveraging all of these particular capabilities of the IoT devices. These are the devices and the botnets that are being used to do specific APT targeting or relay traffic through particular hosts, or provide, attribution or misattribution through these particular, botnets or use cases. So I think that's the bigger problem, is the fact that the smaller things are being leveraged for the big pictures.
Yeah, and I think, as you guys know too, one of the big issues is that, they throw out different numbers, 80, 85, 90% of these attacks would be stopped if had much better cyber hygiene than we have now. So that doesn't stop the really sophisticated, dedicated nation-state attacks, but there's a lot more we can do in just terms of basic cyber hygiene, following, some of the controls. I'm on the board of a company called the Center for Internet Security. It's a nonprofit that has the 20 controls that they're trying to get businesses and individuals to take into account. There's a lot we can do just to get to that stage, so we can get away from a lot of the noise. But we haven't had it yet, because I think people haven't focused on this as a big enough issue, and it's certainly not been mandatory. And I don't see that happen because in our current environment, I just don't see a hard regulatory environment happening until something goes really wrong. And I hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah, the tricky part is a lot of the way these IoT devices are falling into the wrong hands, for lack of a better term, are just like basic authentication, right? In not the technical sense, but just setting a good password, right? Or not reusing a password how do you enact regulations? Do you put those on the manufacturer? Do you put some of that on the consumer? Like, how do you clean that up in any kind of regulatory or standards and compliance?
Well, I mean, you could have something, for instance, in this European, as they roll this out, they're coming up with these standards. You could have something that said, you can't have a hardwired password as part of your Internet of Things device. If you remember that Mirai bot, and that they basically had a hardwired password you couldn't change, or you have to have a password and it has to be changeable. So there are things you can mandate that will not change the technology or undermine innovation, but provide at least some modicum of security to be important. So I think we have to look at the challenge of regulation that people have always talked about is that if you regulate something, you restrict the innovation of that device or that sector. I think we're well beyond. I think you could do smart regulation where you're looking at goals and not technology, and we have to think about how we do that in a smart way.
So you're using technology to help the user, right? You're removing the ability of the user to make stupid decisions, just like phishing. You're putting a technology in place for when the user does not make the best decision and chooses a poor password or doesn't change the default password. You're just removing that option from them and allowing them to make a more intelligent decision as they move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the more that manufacturers enable things by default, I think that, I thought for many years that you have to move security up the stack away from the end user because, even sophisticated end users, we're not that good all the time at doing security ourselves. So you can't expect your 88-year-old grandmother to be that good at it. So we had to find a way to move it beyond. So they're not responsible for the day-to-day security. It's being done at the ISP or higher level. So there might be some technical and structural fixes we can do to this that will help. I think I've seen that starting to happen some places, but we have a ways to go.
I'd like to ask a question, make a comment as well. I think one of the for anybody actually on the panel that has been involved in any kind of policy effort, one of the most difficult challenges in crafting any kind of policy, and I think this applies to legislation as well, is that you've got to try to avoid technology-specific references in the policy. So if you think about the concept of a password, for example, that may actually be a dated concept in as little as a couple of years, right? So, what are the right words when you come down to crafting these pieces of legislation and policy? I mean, is it going to be, credential? Is it going to be identifying information? It's going to be a really, really careful balance, I think, to strike that right tone and get the impact of the legislation or policies that are being enacted to have the right effect. It's a really big challenge.
No, absolutely. Look, I think one of the things that the U.S. has tried to do with it, for instance, its cybercrime legislation, is be technology neutral. So it talks about the effects you're going to have on a computer system rather than the tool you use. Other countries have been much more specific. And so when a new attack vector comes along, like, a botnet or something, they have to change their laws, which is crazy. So it has to be technology. We have to think about that. When we talk about nation-state behavior, I talked about these norms or these rules of the road that we've been negotiating and getting agreement on. And also I've done this as part of this global commission, cyber stability that I've been a commissioner on. We came up with a number of rules there, like don't attack the public core of the internet, for instance. But we focused on the end result. Don't attack the critical infrastructure of another country. Don't attack the certs of another country. Don't, attack the public core of the internet, rather than saying what the tools are or how you might attack. Because that, people talked about, well, should we have a treaty banning cyber weapons? I don't know what a cyber weapon is, and that changes very quickly because of the technology. Look at the results you're trying to hit or encourage, and focus on those.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If you look at it from an impact perspective and not a how you got there, perspective, that's really that I think it's really critical, and you can specify that impact in relatively generic terms, which can have longer lasting impact from a legislative perspective. And I suppose for any one country, it depends on how willing they are to manipulate and rewrite legislation on a regular basis. But we all know, and I think this is probably universally true, that legislation is something that tends to go into effect and stay there for a long time. So it's something you have to proceed with very, very carefully.
No, I agree. And you could also have, things that flow out of legislation, standard setting bodies, et cetera. But I mean, what it also illustrates is a really important thing, which is there's still a gap there, having the technical community and the policy community talk to each other. You can't expect congressmen and senators to understand the technology to write that kind of legislation. You really need to bridge that gap. Too often, the technology community is in one side of the room and the policy community on the other side of the room. And we need to be able to have those groups meet, talk together, people to translate among them, because they need each other.
Do you see any?
That actually begs a question.
Whoa. Everyone's talking at
everybody
once.
wanted to jump on that.
All right, Joff, you have the floor.
Do you how do you feel like we need to jump across that chasm? I mean, without sort of throwing stones, but do you think that the information security community, people like us, for example, in the penetration testing community, or in the consulting community, do you feel like we should be more engaged with our legislators? I mean, what is the process we need to engage in from a general sense to close that gap?
Well, I think there's a lot of things we need to do, but yes, I do think you should be more engaged. I think it's with the legislators, it's with the people at DHS and FBI and DOJ and the State Department. I tried to have regular sessions with people in both the various tech companies, as and some of the trade associations, but also with civil society groups. I had an advisor, a senior technical advisor on my staff, who was a former Motorola engineer who helped invent the cell phone and member of IEEE and other things. And so he actually could call bullshit on things if there was a solution that didn't make any sense. So I think you need that. And I also think that, policy people should be going and talking at these tech conferences. They're doing it, but, the RSA and others, but I think even more than that. And the tech people should not be afraid of the policy folks. I think that contribution is needed. So I think there's lots of different ways to have it happen. I do think some of the senators I've seen have reached out to the tech community when they've been crafting legislation. That's good. I just think more people need to be in the game from the tech community. So
where's the carrot, though? Because for me, I sit here as a technical contributor, and I'm a SANS instructor, and I do a whole bunch of things in the community. But honestly, I do this to feed my family. So if I'm going to be more engaged with a policy effort, what's my incentive?
Well, you don't want them to do something stupid, because something stupid could actually affect your livelihood and what you're doing. Let's say, for instance, penetration testing. At one point, people were saying we need to ban certain kinds of cyber tools. Now, if you do that, that could have huge effects on penetration testing. We're worried about export controls, and there was a move to do things in what's called the Wassenaar Agreement, and that also had an effect on the tech community. There just needs to be, this could actually affect you just like other things can affect you, the government does. So, you're not being wholly altruistic by engaging in this. It actually helps shape the environment that's going to be helpful to you in the long run, too. That's more ethereal. It's not like the bottom line you're going to see, $100 extra on your doorstep the next day, but it's something that's more long-term, but it does affect your livelihood in the long term.
So do you see any innovative initiatives to kind of push this forward as far as regulatory, like outside of regulatory, outside of legislation? Do you see some initiatives and some means in which professionals and or people that just want to contribute to the community and make the world a better place, like where are those happening?
I think there's lots of them out there. I mean, I mentioned this Global Forum for Cyber. That's voluntary. People come together. That's really good. There's a Global Cyber Alliance that has been doing a lot of work around DMARC and other things. It's been really helpful. There's this commission I was on was people who were everything from Jeff Moss or Black Hat to people of the policy community, like former Prime Minister of Sweden and others. So it was a range of different people. So there are opportunities there. I also think there are opportunities at some of these big meetings like RSA, et cetera. I think there's some good places there. But I do see a lot of this activity, as I said, Global Cyber Alliance and others. There's a lot of people who just care about making it a safer place, the internet a safer place, and they're doing a lot of work, often on their own, sometimes for money, but often on their own dime. And I want to encourage that.
Oh,
wait, hold on, Lee. Tyler has a question.
Go ahead.
No, I mean that covered.
We covered it
pretty well. Kind of, if you can plug some of those kind of initiatives, that's one of the hard things. Is there's a lot of people inside of the InfoSec community that want to contribute, that want to make a difference.
Tyler's breaking up.
Want to find or legislative bodies, what are those kind of areas in which we should be looking towards?
Well, I think first there are a number of trade associations for technical folks too. Some are industry specific. Some are things like IEEE, for instance, that I think are very valuable. There's the Internet Society, which is a group of both policy people and technical people, which I think is a very valuable group. I think I mentioned the Global Cyber Alliance, the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise, which I think is a good one. I think there's a lot of these information sharing and advisory groups, ISACs. Those are really good. The Forum for Incident Response and Security Teams, is more technically oriented, but it's been doing a lot of policy work too. I think that's been a good one. So there's a range of ones out there. And I also think, it's like a lot of other things. You can participate in the local level for a lot of these organizations. Like ISOC has regional chapters. They have national chapters and regional chapters all over the world. So there's opportunities to plug in. There's something called the Internet Governance Forum that used to be more about technical internet governance, but now involves security and other issues. That's been good. So I think they take a little more searching than maybe they should. We publicize them and make sure people know about them. I agree with you. So that's something I think is something to focus on over the next couple of years.
I have one other question, and that is maybe a little bit counter to what you said, and perhaps this is biased by the fact that I work all over the country and all over the world, but it seems to me logically that when you look at the federal government, the Congress is going to have some senators and congressmen that are going to be more interested in the topic of cybersecurity than others. And should we not try to engage those people that have that interest rather than try to work locally in our communities and states?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you can do it both. You don't have to choose one or the other. I think you can both work locally and also engage those national leaders. And unfortunately, there are not enough in Congress that have this expertise. There's a commission that was set up under the National Defense Authorization Act called the Solarium Commission. The Cyber Solarium Commission is supposed to mirror the Solarium Commission back for nuclear weapons back in the 50s. But it has, some of the folks on there, the senators and congressmen who are really good at this. Langevin, who is the congressman from Rhode Island, has long been a leader in this area on the Democratic side. There are many others, Mark Warner, and others. On the Republican side, there are a number of folks who really cared about this issue. So I think it's a largely it's still a bipartisan thing, which is good. So I think you can find those folks out there. Unfortunately, it's not universal. A lot of the congressmen and senators don't really understand this yet. And I know when I testify, sometimes there are those who get it that don't. And I want to encourage more to get it. I think the more we can do to try to bring them along, and it's not always easy. And a lot of people don't understand these issues, but if they're really core issues, it's going to be important for them all to really get into these issues.
So it strikes me, and I don't speak for the whole community by any means, but it strikes me that from a personal perspective for a minute, reflecting on this, that a lot of us have a distinct apprehension about getting involved for fear of causing inadvertently a negative effect that impacts our long-term future, which you alluded to earlier, and that could very, very easily happen. And so what I wonder is, and I wouldn't honestly, personally mind being active in this area, but what I wonder is, what is the right and most prudent and cautious way to proceed in order not to push over that boundary and cause mass chaos?
Yeah, look, I don't. This is not unique to cyberspace, right? This is true at any time when you're engaging Congress or legislators on any issue. There's always that danger that they'll go the way they'll go in a different direction. I don't think that's an argument not to engage. I think you have to do it smartly. That's right. I think you have to figure out where they are on the issues and what issues you care about, and try to champion those issues. As I said, there are a number of trade associations that are following what Congress is doing on a whole range of issues, on social media, disinformation, cybersecurity. There have been a bunch, I think, more bills a year and a half than ever. Now, they haven't gotten through, but that does show Congress is much more interested. And I think the danger of not engaging is they'll just do things without your expertise, without your guidance, without understanding. And that can be difficult. And that's also true in international cases. There's a lot of things happening in the UN right now on these norms and nation-state attacks. There's some work being done in New York, and we'll see where that goes. But on the downside, Russia just pushed through a resolution to create so we'll start looking at creating a new cybercrime treaty. We already have one called the Budapest Convention, which is quite good. But Russia wants a new one, and Russia really is focused more on content issues, dissent and other issues. So there's dangerous things happening out there in the policy space too. And what was helpful in that setting is a whole bunch of civil society groups wrote a letter and said, this is a problem, and here's why. And that helped galvanize, I think, some of the debates. So there is a role to play. There's always a danger we'll go a different way. But if you don't engage, you almost guarantee it will go in the wrong.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good point, and I think more of us should pay attention to exactly that point. If we take the passive approach and stand back and let it happen, things will happen that we don't necessarily like, and probably things won't happen that we would like to have happen. So yeah, okay.
One key thing
Thank you.
Raising this issue. I mean, this is, like we all said earlier in this discussion, this is not a front of center issue for the public right now or for governments, and that has to change. And I think, the tech community can really be a voice in helping deliver that message.
Agreed.
Lee, did you have questions?
So one of the things I've been thinking about as we're working with different regulatory bodies here at the national level, at the state level, or even internationally, how do you achieve parity of regulation? I mean, at the national level, we seem to be slow to pass some of this regulation when, GDPR came out, and then California came out with their data protection rules, like right away. I'm thinking, how do you wind up with somebody saying, "Oh, I'm going to raise the bar weight up"? How do you get equivalency across the board? Is it possible? Is that what advocacy will help with?
I think it ends up being less equivalency than kind of interoperability. So, taking another example, California was among the first states that had data breach law in place, data breach notification law. We also gave a safe harbor going to law enforcement about that. And that was a big deal. And now every state in the union, all the 50 states have data breach laws. We still don't have a national, which I think is crazy. We need a national one because having 50 different state laws seems a little crazy. But what happens is, if you're a business and you do your business nationally, or even in a few states, you pick the lowest common denominator, the one that's the strongest. And I think that's what the California legislation is likely to be. Most of these industries don't just operate in California, but operate around the country. And so they're going to start following those California prescriptions. Same with the GDPR. The GDPR, I think has some, it has some problematic things, but it has some positive things too that really push people toward more security in terms of like large fines for data breaches, et cetera. But as much as people in the U.S. have complained about it, it's become a global standard, not just in Europe, but other countries around the world are adopting it. If the U.S. wanted to be in that position, we should have actually come up with our own alternative. We should have had our own data privacy law. We have not. I testified about this a few months ago, and we're still looking at it. So we need to have our own alternatives. We have to, just doing nothing doesn't always help, because then what other countries are doing becomes the global standard, for better or worse. Now, sometimes it's better, and we'll just see how this plays out. But I think that's how you get the kind of interoperability. It's not parity, but everyone just follows the stuff that's out there if they're global companies, because they have no real choice.
Yeah. Well, I chose parity because I was worried that the alternative could result in anarchy or other, tail spinning or ineffective. But that was probably a bad choice of terms.
Yeah,
I wanted to see if we can move forward.
If you have conflicting laws and regulations, unfortunately we don't have that yet. But if you have conflicting ones, then that really puts businesses and other people in a bind. And one of the problems that we've had for a long time, despite Europe thinking that the U.S. does not have strong privacy, which is not true, the U.S. has some very strong data privacy laws around access to data by law enforcement. And that made it very difficult for other countries to get information, even on their own citizens, from providers in the U.S. And there's been some work in the U.S. Cloud Act to try to address that, to make it easier for countries to do that if they have the right kind of protections in place. So we're slowly moving toward this area where we're trying to address these international concerns. But again, this is, it's an international environment. It takes laws to not move quickly or surely or sometimes at all. So we also have to figure out other ways to deal with these issues.
That will, I think, round up the questions and the interview. Short of the 5 questions with Security Weekly, Chris, that we ask all of our guests on the show. So are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
I'm ready to play.
3 words to describe yourself.
Avid cyber moviegoer.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
That's a good one. A bottle of wine.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Colossus, the Painter Project.
In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
First.
Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Live, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Jeff, I was waiting for you to get it, but
Harrison Ford and Katharine Hepburn.
Nice.
Chris, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly this evening.
Very happy to do it. Very happy to be with you. As I said, this is a big issue. I'm glad you guys are looking at this. And I'm sad you didn't ask me what my favorite movie was, because I used to have movie posters in my old State Department offices where hackers or computers were the main characters. I had about 30 of them. So.
So now we have to know what your favorite movie is.
Now we have to know what the favorite movie is. Yeah.
My favorite one. There's almost all these movies are dystopian. There's not really any happy cyber movies, but my favorite was one from 1970. Not the earliest cyber. The earliest cyber movie was from 1958. But 1970, it's called Colossus: the Forbin. The U.S. builds Colossus, this giant computer in the mountains of Colorado, to control its nuclear arms, take the man out of the middle, and have perfect deterrence. The Russians, the Soviets back then, stole the information, built Guardian, their version, in the Urals. The 2 computers started talking to each other, and to protect humankind from themselves, they took away all civil liberties and took over the world. This was years before Terminator, years before The Matrix. It's well worth watching if you haven't.
Years before Amazon, Facebook, and Google too. So
yes, that's true too.
And we can ask Jeff; he was there.
I started prosecuting before there was a web. There was an internet, but there wasn't a web. So I go way back.
Fantastic.
So what was the title of that movie again?
Colossus: the Forbin Project.
Okay.
Fantastic.
It's kitschy, but it's worth watching.
Yeah, it sounds awesome. Chris, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Happy to do it. Happy to be here with you guys. Thank you.
With that, we'll take a short break, come back with the security news for this week. Stay tuned.